Welcome to the Art Elevator. I'm your host, Larissa Wild. Join me on this podcast as I dig deep interviewing art historians, curators, appraisers, artists, and more to bring you lifetimes of knowledge in a digestible format to elevate your knowledge of art. Today's guest is Anjan Chatterjee, and he is a professor of neurology, psychology, and architecture, and is also the founding director of the Penn Center of NeuroAesthetics. He's won awards for his work in the fields of cognitive neurology, as well as psychology and art, and written some fascinating books on these topics. Thank you for being here today on the Art Elevator podcast, Anjan. To start this discussion, can you take me back to the moment that you decided to enter this field?
Yeah, it's an anecdote, a particularly salient anecdote that I wrote about recently in a new book we have out. I was on faculty at the University of Alabama in Birmingham for the first 7 years of my career, from 92 to 99. And Penn, which is where I am now, which is also where I got my medical degree, was starting a center for cognitive neuroscience, and I was being recruited. I had two close friends in Birmingham, and on Friday afternoons, we would get together at our favorite bar and kind of talk about life and talk about our work, and it was just a nice way to wrap up the week. One of my colleagues, who liked to ask these big counterfactual questions, brought up the question, if you imagine yourself 10 years into the future and look back, what would you regret if you hadn't done professionally? And I thought about it. My research up until that point had been around visual and spatial processing, around language, around attention. And I thought, if I never studied aesthetic experiences professionally, I would probably regret it. So that was late 98, early 99. And at the time, there was virtually nothing written about it. And 10 years is a nice chunk of time because you don't have to do anything right away. You can start to make incremental moves in a direction. So that is when, based on that conversation, that I decided to study aesthetic experiences using neuroscience.
What a gift that question was in the both the approach and making you really think about it, but also allowing you to have that time frame, because something like this it's such a new field that deciding which approach and which angle and how to even think about it or tackle it, I'm sure, is a very big and time-consuming occupation in itself.
Yeah, certainly glad I did it. It's now consumed the last quarter of a century of my thinking, so it's
Right.
it has had staying power. For some of your listeners that might be younger, this might be an experience that is unfamiliar to them. When I moved to Penn, because I was going to start this new field, I wondered, excuse me, when I moved to Penn, I wandered around the library. This is before PDFs were easily available, and wandered through the stacks, picking up journals to see what kind of academic writing there was on this topic. And so it was very old-fashioned searching in a way that many people no longer have that experience.
It really is a different experience when you go out to find information. There's too much of it, and it's how do you navigate it in a meaningful way? It's the opposite, really, the experience today. So a question for you: are you able to explain the automatic response to beauty in the brain and behavior so we can understand the basics?
Yeah, so beauty, it's worth pointing out that there's something magical about beauty, and this gets reflected even in the kinds of language we use when we talk about beauty. So often we will talk about or use words like charming or enchanting or glamorous. These are all words that have roots in magic and spells. So I think we recognize that there's something magical about beauty. And I would like your listeners to at least know that we don't think that a scientific account or investigations into beauty ends up being deflationary, that this really is, in some ways, I find it enhances or increases my sense of wonder about the notion. So having said that, getting to your question, if we take beauty in faces, for example, as a classic example, when you think of something or someone who's beautiful, we often think about faces. What we have shown, and other people as well, is that when somebody is looking at a beautiful face, two things happen, at least, which is part of our visual system in our occipital cortex. Parts of the brain that are especially tuned to processing faces get more activated by beautiful faces. And the front of the brain, deep in structures that are important for rewards, those areas also get activated. So the experience of beauty seems to be, for visual beauty, seems to be simultaneously neural activity in our visual system and in the system of our brain that delivers pleasure and rewards. And so it's that simultaneous activity. It's as though our vision is infused with pleasure, seems to be an account of what beauty is in the brain. Now, it turns out that this is happening even when people are not actively thinking about beauty. So that kind of response seems to be automatic. It seems as though we are responding to beauty in our environment, even if we are consciously thinking about something else at the time.
Interesting. And so how malleable is this experience of beauty?
Yeah, the experience of beauty is quite malleable. You can think about it in the following way, which is that we have suggested a framework for aesthetic experiences that involves three large-scale systems. So one has to do with the design of our sensory and motor systems. And a trivial example of that might be, you could be looking at a beautiful sunset, or there's information in that sunset, perhaps in the infrared spectrum, that our eyes don't even register. So it's a trivial example to say not everything out in the world is something that our biology is designed to apprehend, right? So there are some constraints on the kinds of things we can find beautiful. The second system is our emotion and reward system, as I mentioned. And typically with beauty, there's a pleasure component. And that's the part that gives value to objects that we might be apprehending. And so that's another big component of beauty. And then finally is the component that has to do with semantics and meaning. And that system modulates our experience of beauty. You can imagine, or you can think of the ways in which people's individual experiences, their backgrounds, has an effect on what they might find beautiful. The culture in which they grow up, their education has a big impact on what people might find beautiful. So that's one way that the experience of beauty is malleable. Our sensory motor systems tend to be more similar than different. We're all designed in a pretty similar way, unless you happen to be congenitally blind or have hearing impairments. But in the absence of that, those systems are quite consistent. Emotions start to get a little more variable in terms of how we carve out the world, but our knowledge and meaning systems can be quite different. And that is a way that the experience of beauty can be quite malleable.
So what you're saying is there are the basic functions of the brain and the responses to seeing things that we all have programmed, But then there's the cultural, like nature versus nurture. You've got the nurture side of what you have been exposed to in your life and what has happened and how you've reacted to those and how society places value or judgment or other attributes to those sorts of visual systems. Is that correct?
It is correct. I would just maybe make a slight modification, which is that we end up not really distinguishing nature and nurture in such a distinct way, because whatever nurture does has an effect on our brain. So it's not that there's this brain that is fixed and then there's this nurture stuff out there that happens independently of what's happening in the brain. And so a very easy and clear example is reading and writing. Reading and writing doesn't happen naturally, right? You have to actually be taught this. It doesn't matter how much you stare at squiggles on a page. Unless you're taught it, you're not going to learn how to read and write. It turns out if you are literate, there is a part of our visual brain that is referred to as the visual word form area that is specialized in identifying letters and words. And people who are not literate don't have that area in their brain, right? So here's an example of a cultural, something that has been learned culturally that occupies a certain amount of real estate in our brain. And at least pointing out that these notions of nature and nurture end up not being quite as distinct as people tend to frame it initially.
That's a fantastic clarification. I think we do tend to simplify things just so we can wrap our little brains, no puns intended, around these ideas, but that really clarifies a lot. And I find it very interesting that there's a visual word form area of the brain. If someone were to not be literate, would they be using that part of the brain for something else? Or does it just sit there?
We use most of our brain all the time. There's another myth out there that we only use 10% or 20% of our brain, which is utter nonsense, right?
Okay, good.
All the
as long as it's not less than 10%.
Right. That's a part of the brain that processes visual information. I think it gets co-opted by these visual word forms. And there is some degree of malleability within the brain itself. So for example, people who are congenitally blind, for example, that learn how to read Braille, parts of their visual system gets co-opted by their tactile sensation. So the way in which our experiences tend to modify some of the hardwiring of the brain is quite persistent across different domains.
That is an area that's very interesting, and it's definitely gray. I keep coming up with these terrible words when we're talking about brain stuff, that you can feel a color or you can remember a smell, and that's very abstract, or this crossover of different senses because we are processing. It's not like everything happens completely compartmentalized, right?
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah, because that is one thing that a lot of people talk about when they look at art that they really connect to, is they like the feeling that it gives them. And thinking back to what you said on the different systems, you've got the reward center. So there's obviously something that could be going on there. But then there's the meaning part. And the meaning part is probably the part that fascinates me the most. Can you talk a little bit more about that system?
Yeah. When we started this conversation, at least before you started recording, I asked if you're from Australia, and it was for a specific reason, because there was an example I wanted to give if this topic came up.
Okay.
I have, for a long time, been particularly interested and fascinated by Australian Aboriginal art. And it has a kind of abstract quality that I find very appealing, in the sense that there are Western traditions of abstract expression that feel not so dissimilar at least superficially, from this kind of art, right? So I have an association with it, based on other art that I like. A few years ago, I was invited to a conference in Darwin, and so went to Australia. It's the first time I'd been in Australia, and took the opportunity to travel. Took the opportunity to travel to Uluru, which the pictures have always seemed amazing to me. And so I went out there, camped for 3 nights over there. And so a couple of things happened, which is flying over the Australian outback, all of a sudden the color palette of that artwork became so much more vivid, like seeing what the landscape was and the way in which this art is really connected to the land, and just starting to learn a little bit about the symbolism of this kind of artwork and the role that these images play within this culture that is otherwise completely unfamiliar and foreign to me. So it's just scratching the surface. I wouldn't claim to have any kind of knowledge of the role that this kind of art plays in the lives of people, of Aboriginal people there. But just knowing a little bit and having experience of the land changed my experience of art that I already liked. So that's just a trivial example to say, maybe not so trivial, but an example to say that information in this point, experiential information of the outback, and learning just a few things about the symbolism in there and the role that this art played in navigation and the connection to the land completely enhanced my experience of the art.
I'm so glad that you had that experience, because that is, thinking about Aboriginal art is actually something that I absolutely love. And the idea that the symbolism and the color and the stories and the mark making is actually all about this multi-layered, multi-leveled map of how to exist in a space. And on a basic level, we're talking about just perhaps, if we look at the work of Emily Kamanguera, and she's talking about the yam dreaming and perhaps how to find food and how to understand the landscape and that sort of thing. But then if you look at it in other ways, it's this multi-layered experience where you can take it to different levels. Now, I'm not talking about just the tourist art. I'm talking more about the symbolism on and when it went from being painted on the body to transitioning with Western influence to being more on a canvas in a more abstract. But I do find that completely fascinating. And another area that I find very fascinating that Aboriginal art crosses over with many other cultures that are, I don't know what the right word is, more tribal, ancient civilizations, is the idea of bricolage. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, but bricolage is basically taking concrete objects and pinning abstract concepts to them so that we can explain the world. And if you think about religion or different cultural beliefs and myths and that sort of thing, it's a way that you can take things that are around you and understand the world in its abstract manner, but through mechanisms that are concrete that you recognize.
That's fascinating. I think just to be very explicit and blunt about it, since we're talking about the brain, so these are examples where the same visual information is falling in your eyes and then being processed by the rest of your brain. But the experience of the exact same visual information is dramatically changed if you have this kind of knowledge that you're talking about. Whether it's a deeper knowledge of Aboriginal history, of Aboriginal relationship to the land, and even these examples of bricolage. It brings up another function of art that we've been interested in, which is the way in which art both communicates information, but can also enhance understanding, which has historically been a big role for art. But as a scientist, that's always very hard to try to pin down. What does that actually mean, that art can have a transformative effect, or art can enhance your understanding of the world?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's probably something that's easier to study in retrospect when you've seen the course of history go by. Perhaps we're talking about the transition from medieval art through to Renaissance art. And with the knowledge of where we've ended up, it's easy to look back and trace those things, but probably very hard to trace in the moment, right?
Yeah, we're trying to. One way that we're going about this, I have a grant to try to look at this, is first to try to establish a taxonomy. And this ties into this notion of knowledge and meaning, because the tool that we have to both communicate knowledge and meaning most at our disposal is language. I start out by talking about charm and glamorous and how these kinds of terms imply a kind of magic to beauty. But language ends up being an important way to understand complex experiences and enhance those experiences and make discriminations. So we got interested in this notion of what kind of impact can artwork have. And our way of going about this was a multidisciplinary convening a panel, a multidisciplinary panel, which had different kinds of experts. So someone who is an expert in psychology of art, someone who's an expert in the philosophy of art, someone who's a theologian who focuses on visual iconography in religion, someone who's an art historian, and I represented neuroscience, trying to come up with, when artwork have big impacts on people, what are the kinds of words that we would use? So would you say, for example, transcendent or challenging or elevating or inducing a sense of humility? What's the whole range of kinds of impacts one might have? And so from this, we're right now in the middle of a project trying to establish a taxonomy, just a language of what impact art has, before we're going to try to do some experimental work to see, at least in the short run, whether art, what's the catalog of reactions that people can have to art. Now that's talking at a very, at a time scale that's much more immediate than what you're mentioning, which is when you look back and you say, over the last 20 years, that this movement really had an impact on our entire culture, which is a much broader scale than what we're trying to do for now, and try to reformulate those questions into an experimental framework.
And that is so fascinating. With the world moving at such a fast pace and interest dropping in a lot of the school systems in teaching art, and the relevance of maybe going into a museum, there's not so much, especially with shutdowns, but besides that, just it's not so critical to a lot of people's lives, and they just don't see the importance of it. How can you take that way of thinking about art and using art as a meaning creation system and bring that into the real world here and now, so that people can feel more connected to what it is and the benefits?
Yeah, I would say one thing the pandemic, I think, has done, as we've been more confined to where we live, traveled, we're not traveling as much as perhaps we did before. I think people have been much more sensitized to the aesthetics of their environment. When you're sitting in a room that now, instead of just where you wake up in the morning and return at the end of a busy day, you're there all the time. And all of a sudden, I think many people are discovering that they're more sensitized to the color of the walls and what do they have hanging up. Oh, I haven't changed that piece of decoration in 25 years. It's pretty old.
Yeah.
So I think people are getting a little more sensitized just to the aesthetics of their environment. And apparently, I'm told that gardening and plants have become big deal. And I think that in combination with, there has been a kind of slowing down. To me, art affords a vehicle for both those things, which is slowing down and immersing yourself in an aesthetic experience. So the pandemic may actually have these secondary effects of getting people to slow down and pay attention to their environment. I went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art a couple of weeks ago because there's a big Jasper Johns exhibit there. I was shocked at how crowded the museum was, as though people seemed like they were really hungering to get in there.
Yes, absence makes the heart grow fonder. If you haven't been able to do it, it's suddenly more appealing.
Yeah.
Let's jump back a little bit to some more technical brain stuff.
Yes.
Can you tell me what the evaluation of art looks like in the brain?
Depends on what kind of art we're talking about. And so if we take that same tripartite division I talked about, if you're looking at representational art, it turns out that our visual brain carves out the world into people, places, and things. And it's probably not so surprising that in representational art, portraits, landscapes, and still lives are big topics. Right?
I'm sure you scientists love when it lines up so perfectly.
We do love it when it lines up so perfectly. And then, as I mentioned before, there's also this culturally induced part of the visual brain, which is the visual word form area. So you can throw in calligraphy and the art also within that kind of domain. So the first point is that the nature of the content of the art is going to have an influence on what parts of our visual brain are responsive. When it comes to abstract art, those patterns make a difference. We have shown, as have other people, that certain kinds of art in which there is a lot of implied motion. So Jackson Pollock would be a good example of that parts of our brain that are engaged in apprehending visual motion, but also our motor systems are more engaged with those kinds of artworks. So on the sensory motor side, it depends on what's the content of the art. Then you can ask about the emotion parts of that. And for art that people like, pleasure is going to be involved, and that takes us to the front of the brain in deep structures. There's an area called the ventral striatum, and a particular part of that called the nucleus accumbens, that turn out are responsive to all kinds of pleasures, the most basic pleasures, food, sex. And so the kind of pleasure we get out of art taps into these very ancient core systems that are important for our existence, for our survival. There are other parts of the brain within that, areas called the orbitofrontal cortex, parts of the insula that are also engaged. The insula is an important and interesting structure because it controls our autonomic nervous system. So our sympathetic nervous system, when we get excited and our hands get a little sweaty, our heart rate goes up, that's being controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system, when you feel relaxed, you feel everything is feeling a little chill, the parasympathetic nervous system gets involved. And so you can imagine how art can do all of those things, right? Some art is arousing. You want it to get people excited, but other art might be relaxing. And then there's art that is provoking, that might have some negative emotions mixed in them. And so you can imagine how art can do all of them. Horror would be an example, or if you were to look at art by Hieronymus Bosch, for example, or Francis Bacon. These are jarring images, right? I'm not sure everybody looks at Francis Bacon and the first thing they think is pleasure, right?
Except maybe me.
Perhaps you. But these are powerful works. And I think the argument in the literature has been that sometimes if you just have a little bit of negative valence inserted in that, the art can be even more powerful. And so what that means is that other parts of the brain that normally might respond in situations of fear or threat. So the amygdala is one structure that is commonly associated with those kinds of responses, that a little bit of engagement in that part of the brain, along with pleasure, if your name is Larissa Wild, then you have a completely different and powerful experience of something that other people might view as disgusting. And this, again, is where education comes in, which is a certain amount of knowledge can have a huge impact on what we're looking at. And a simple example of that latter point is where this was an experiment that was done in Copenhagen a number of years ago, where people were shown abstract images. They're in a fMRI scanner. And in one situation, they're told that these are images that were hanging in an upscale gallery in Copenhagen. And in another condition, they're told that a computer randomly generated these images. Going back to an earlier point, exactly the same information is coming through people's eyes. But if they think it's hanging in a gallery, which is the smallest amount of relevant information, they actually end up thinking, getting more pleasure out of the same image. And this shows up in their brain that within these pleasure areas, they have more neural activity to the exact same image, just being told that this is hanging in a gallery as opposed to a computer generated.
Oh my gosh, this is getting so interesting. Let's tag that, but go forwards to the part where you were talking backwards to the part where you were talking about how if you put in just a little bit of imagery that triggers fear or recoil or any of these other emotions that people don't often associate with beauty and art, that to me is where art starts to get really interesting. And as somebody who sees a lot of art, I related a little bit like the flavors in food. You see a lot of stuff that looks nice and it's pretty, and maybe for a lot of people it triggers that part of the brain that is pleasure and the rest of it. To me, it's eating too much candy. It's all sweet. Yeah. And so for me, I find art fascinating when it is on that edge of, yes, it has to be beautiful and it has to have that visual language that we see and understand and relate to. Otherwise, there's no connection. But once you bring in those other elements that really pin down, I think, part of what I find fascinating about what I would call, in my judgmental terms, good art.
Taste is a really good analogy because I think it works that way. And so for things that are sweet, just a little bit of acidity or salt in it makes it more pleasurable to eat. So it's just not some vapid, sickening, saccharine sweet thing. Yeah. But acid and salt, sometimes a little bit of chocolate. People love chocolate. It's got a strong bitter taste in there, dark chocolate. So I think these analogies to taste, where sweet is enhanced, can be enhanced by acid and bitter and salt. Apply. I share your sensibility about that in terms of art as well.
Yeah, that just made the way I see art a whole lot more clear. Thank you. Now let's jump forward to the other point, which I'm struggling to remember what it was now. because I got so carried away with that thought. What was you were talking about?
Oh, I've lost track of what we're talking about.
Okay, let's jump to the last question then. So this is all fascinating, and people love it when science can tie in with something that maybe we don't connect as being able to be broken down scientifically, such as beauty or art. Is there potential for misuse of neuroaesthetics in the art industry, and what could that look like?
I think there is a danger for neuroaesthetics to be misused in the art industry. And there are several ways it could happen. A few years ago, about 10 years ago or longer, I wrote a paper called Brain Branding, when science and commerce collide. And this idea that brain information can be misused depending on the context. People tend to, in general, give neuroscience a lot of weight, that somehow if it's in your brain, it's real. And that sometimes is justified and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a reframing of something. So for example, if I said, people listening to your podcast learned something, that's a statement, hopefully is true. But if I said people listening to your podcast had their brains change, right? That feels somehow different when you're saying exactly the same thing, because if you've learned something, your brain has changed, right? So it's just a way of putting neuroscience terms on a statement that nobody would think twice about. But all of a sudden now it feels somehow more profound, right? So there's a marketing of brain language that sometimes is referred to as the seductive allure of neuroscience. But there are other ways, I think, where people can misuse neuroscience and give it a framing that perhaps doesn't make sense, and where the commerce gets ahead of where the science actually is. Examples are, recently I got asked to comment, and a few people send me these links to a gallery show where people were entering into the gallery with various sensors on them. So sensors on their skin to tell what kind of responses they were having, autonomic responses they're having in their skin. They had brain waves, a mobile EEG on their heads, so it could record brain waves, and they're also wearing glasses, so their eye movements could be recorded. All very cool technology. But what's far from clear is, if you have all of that information, what does this actually mean? Now, these are active scientific questions, and we haven't sorted it out yet. But before that gets sorted out, the kind of marketing one might use is to say that even if you don't know what you think of the art, your body knows what you think of the art. And we're going to assess what your body is saying, because somehow that's more real and more true than what comes out of your mouth when you say, I like this art, or I find this art disgusting. And it turns out that those physiologic measures, we don't know typically what they mean. So going back to this question of arousal, so you have greater skin responses, which is basically a measure of sweat that changes conductance, right? That happens because your sympathetic nervous system is being activated. That could happen because you're excited. It could happen because you're afraid. It could happen because you're angry. So this marker doesn't tell you which of those things are, but But there is a way in which, rather than asking you, are you excited? Are you angry? Are you afraid? Let's let your body tell us that. And I think that's a misuse of neuroscience, to give the experience of engaging with art a kind of physiologic reality, which is there, but it's the interpretation of that physiology that is, the science just isn't there yet. And I can see how those sorts of things, those kinds of technologies might be very seductive to people who don't understand what those markers mean.
Absolutely. It's diagnosing through just symptoms that could be symptoms of lots of things, and just making a subjective choice on which ones you want them to mean.
But in this case, it's because the symptoms are neurophysiologic, people think, oh, that's real. That's really real.
Yeah. And that's where the magic comes back in, because those things, once you isolate them into arousal and all these other things, it's that mixture, the alchemy of them all together in your unique brain that is producing the truth of what you're really seeing and feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Now, before we go, can you tell me a little bit about, I know you've written a couple of books on this topic.
So I have a first authored book that was published, I think, around 2014. It's called The Aesthetic Brain: How We Evolved to, how does it go? I can't even remember.
2014 is a long time ago.
Yeah.
I'm reading it, so I can tell you.
Yeah, I think it's something like how we evolved to enjoy beauty, or something, beauty, and appreciate art, something like that. But The Aesthetic Brain, so that's a single author book. It has 3 sections: one section on beauty, one section on pleasure, and one section on art. And then more recently, meaning in the last few weeks, we have another book, an edited book, Brain, Beauty, and Art. And what we did in this book was, because the field of neuroaesthetics is so young, it seemed an opportune time to publish such a book. We went back over the last 20 years and picked out what we think are seminal papers in the field, and asked the authors to write a short essay, popular science essay, about their original work. So each of the essays is tethered to a peer-reviewed publication, and the authors were asked to address 3 questions. What were they thinking when they wrote the original article? What were their main findings or claims? And how would they contextualize what they said then to where the field is right now? And so this is I think, a relatively easy way for people, if they're interested in the field of neuroaesthetics, to get a history of what's happened in the last 20 years that's leading up to now. The most recent paper in there was published last year. So give you a history of this field contextualized by the people who are actively working in this field.
Fantastic. So a lot of different perspectives on a very young and emerging field. That sounds brilliant. I'm going to have links to all of these in the show notes.
Oh, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Anjan, for being here today. This has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I could keep it going for hours, but I know we have our time limits. So I really appreciate the time that you've given to us today.
Great. Thank you. Hope your and your listeners' brains have changed from listening to this.
In the best possible way.
The best possible way.
Thanks for joining us on the Art Elevator today. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. If you found this podcast to be super helpful, please leave a review to spread the word. In the show notes below, you will find links mentioned in the interview and more.